ISIL continues to grab headlines with its horrific attacks across the world, but after years of battling a US-led coalition, the Iraqi government, Kurdish and Arab groups, it's lost territory, fighters and leaders. So in this upfront special, I'll ask a panel of experts, is this really the beginning of the end for ISIL? Joining me on this special programme to discuss the future of ISIL are Hassan Hassan, Senior Fellow at the Tahrir Institute for Middle East Policy and co-author of the book ISIS Inside the Army of Terror, Ahmet Yayla, a former counter-terrorism chief for the Turkish police and currently a Senior Research Fellow at the International Centre for the Study of Violent Extremism, from Atlanta, Mia Bloom, a professor at Georgia State University who's working on a new book about how ISIL recruits child fighters, and from Baghdad, Muaffaq al-Rubai, Iraq's former national security advisor and currently a member of parliament. Thank you all for joining me on Upfront. Hassan, let me begin with you. It was just 2 years ago when ISIL controlled a combination of Iraqi and Syrian territory the size of Italy. They had something like 10 million people forced to live under their brutal so-called caliphate. Today, though, ISIL has been mostly driven out of Mosul in Iraq. Its capital in Syria, Raqqa, is surrounded pretty much on all sides. ISIL fighters are reportedly abandoning the caliphate. There are fewer and fewer foreign fighters going to join the so-called caliphate. Given all of that, is it all over for ISIL in your view?
Not just yet.
Not just yet, okay.
The campaign against ISIS is going very well. ISIS is on the back foot, as you know, but it still controls lots of areas in Iraq and Syria. In fact, what I call the third capital of ISIS is still far from over, which is the area in Anbar, and the area that links Anbar to Deir ez-Zor in Syria. This is the only area where ISIS controls two areas on the borders. And I think that's a long way to go to defeat ISIS in that area. We already see problems between Iran and the US because of that campaign, because of that area.
Okay. Muaffaq al-Rubai, do you agree with Hassan? Iraqi forces are currently in the midst of an offensive to take back the last district of Mosul, its Iraqi stronghold. Is ISIL finished, at least in most of Iraq?
Well, we have managed to clear most of the territories of our country which were occupied by ISIS in June 2014. But people are missing the point here, honestly. People are looking on territories, on the security measures, on the economic measures, and on political measures. We are missing, the whole world is missing the point. This is not, this is an ideological challenge, and that is more important than anything else. So they're on the run, and they're on the, but this is not the end of it.
Okay, you make a good point about ideology, and we will come back to that later in the programme. Just sticking with the situation on the ground in the region and globally. Mia Bloom, a lot of people say that the recent wave of attacks across the world, especially the ones targeting the West, are a sign that ISIL is in decline and it's acting out of desperation. Is that a view you share?
It is, and I think Minister al-Rubai is absolutely right. There might be this inverse relationship between how poorly ISIS is doing on the ground and the fact that they're on the run, and the need for them to project power elsewhere. So by either instigating attacks, failed attacks in Brussels or successful attacks in France or in the UK, this is a way where they remain relevant and give the illusion that they are still powerful and still in control. But the other point beyond the ideology is the fact that we are, from looking at ISIS social media, what they're saying in their chat rooms and on their official statements, they seem to be expanding in different directions. We're seeing a lot of material in Bahasa. We're seeing a lot of activity, whether it's in Manila or in the Philippines and the greater areas. So we are seeing more on-the-ground activities, but not in Iraq and Syria, but in Southeast Asia.
Ahmet Yayla, you were a counter-terrorism police chief in Turkey up until a couple of years ago. What do you say to people who say, well, they controlled huge swathes of territory. That was their big selling point, that they controlled territory in a way that al-Qaeda never controlled territory. They declared themselves a caliphate in a way that al-Qaeda never declared themselves a caliphate. So if they lose that territory, if they lose the caliphate, that's quite a big blow to their image and their mystique, is it not?
Definitely, it's a big blow, and it will affect their presence their propaganda and new recruits. However, they have a solid ideology when it comes to reaching out to their supporters and to the people who support them ideologically. It really doesn't change a lot, because if you believe in that terrorist organization and its ideology, and if you are loyal to that, you are still a threat. So it doesn't matter from their perspective whether they are losing or not.
Okay, let me ask you this, Hassan. The US has been leading a coalition bombing campaign of ISIL since 2014. That's what's pushed ISIL out of a lot of its strongholds. But there's also a view that killing huge numbers of civilians from the air, and just this month the UN said that the US-led coalition has caused a, quote, staggering loss of civilian life in Syria. That killing civilians in that way only helps ISIL. It helps them recruit, it creates new grievances, it destabilizes the region further. Is that a fair critique?
It is very fair. I think it's quite worrying what we see over the past few months, which is with the surge in civilian casualties in Raqqa and elsewhere. Some people say this is because of the new administration, because of the kind of the relaxed rules of engagement. So the rules of engagement haven't changed, but the way they implement certain intel or act on certain intel seems to have changed. The problem with that is obviously you increase the grievances of people, and you allow a situation where ISIS can tell people that this campaign is not here to help you. What the Americans are doing in Mosul and Raqqa is the same as what Russia has done in Aleppo. So this is about Sunnis. It's not really about terrorism. But I think it's also the reason behind this, or one reason, is that because the campaign against ISIS has reached a point where it's conducted in crowded areas in Mosul and Raqqa.
So it's unavoidable, is that what you're saying?
I think it's avoidable. They just want to do it fast.
But just to take a step back before I go to the other guests, do you think the US-led bombing campaign in and of itself was the wrong strategy in terms of dealing with ISIL?
The US-led campaign has done a lot of bad things, and I think it backfired in many respects. It allowed a situation where people can say this is the US has been reluctant to work with Sunni forces, for example.
Ahmed Yaila, how much has Turkey helped or hindered the military campaign against ISIL? Because you have Kurdish forces, namely the Kurdish People's Protection Units, the YPG, being armed by the US to fight ISIL. And then you have Turkish jets bombing those same US-backed forces, saying they're Kurdish terrorists. It's not exactly a united front against ISIL in that part of the world, is it?
Definitely not. And Turkey is not literally in that coalition. Erdogan is not helping the coalition forces to counter the ISIS threat. And his priorities are different. And we can easily say that if Erdogan's allowance to ISIS had not existed in the past, we would not have this kind of a big terrorist organization.
Muafak, I've got to ask you about civilian casualties from quote-unquote Shia militias in Iraq. Human rights groups have documented that in operations to retake ISIL territory, there have been summary killings, enforced disappearances, torture, the destruction of homes by groups within the Popular Mobilization Forces, the PMF, the so-called Shia militias. Surely that is A, inexcusable, but B, is only going to help ISIL in the long run?
This is total lie. There is no foundation for that, and these are what I call remote reportings. We are on the ground, and the lead is taken by the Iraqi army, by the federal police.
But Human Rights Watch has been on the ground. Amnesty has been on the ground. Journalists have been on the ground. They've all documented this stuff, Muafak.
Well, I'm sorry to say that this is from where I sit in Baghdad. I cannot see any of these violations, and this is Mahdi. This is war, and war you can see, and the Prime Minister is very, very strict in taking these allegations into consideration and in taking them very, very seriously.
Ahmed Yaila wants to come in.
Yes, I cannot agree with him, because I have spoken to a few people on the ground in Mosul, and what they were telling to me was heartbreaking. They mentioned about rapes, breaking into homes, stealing whatever they had, and basically trying to steer away all the Sunni population where they were invading. And several people started to think that at least with the ISIS, our chastity and belongings were safe. Now they came here, they are killing our young people, they are raping our daughters. So ISIS was essentially, after this, better for us.
Mia.
Even during the peace, Mehdi, we can't discount the fact that the Maliki regime abused the Sunni population to such an extent that ISIS found, fodder among Iraqi Sunnis, at least at the outset. And so the idea that the Shia militias haven't done anything wrong, it's absolutely, I mean, this is not fake news. We know this. We know this to be true, that it was during the period in between that the Shia militias, in fact, created a very fertile ground for ISIS to blossom.
Muwafaq, do you want to respond to that?
I certainly do not agree on that. There is no human rights violation, and they have to give some discount to the war circumstances in the area, and there are so many so many retaliations, so many vengeance, so many people are taking the law into their hand. But this is not the popular mobilization forces we are talking about, and they are part of the Iraqi security forces now.
Okay, Hassan, some might say, a lot of Iraqis might say, it's all very well blaming militias who are taking the fight to ISIL, losing a lot of people in war, as Muwafaq al-Rabai says, in terms of sectarianism. What about the other side of the coin? Haven't Iraq and Syria's neighbours, especially the Gulf countries, especially Saudi Arabia, funded, armed, ideologically backed a lot of pretty nasty and sectarian groups on the ground, especially in Syria?
I think as a Syrian, I would blame all these countries, especially Turkey and Qatar, especially in the northern Syria, for the supportive groups like Ahrar al-Sham and Jabhat al-Nusra, directly or indirectly. And I think these countries have done the most damage. The backers of the opposition have done more damage to the Syrian opposition than Iran and Assad and Russia, in dividing them, in strengthening extremists in their midst. So I think there is a lot of blame to go to these countries.
You do, and Mia, you're nodding there.
I agree. I think that, when we look at, also I would include Saudi Arabia, the fact that a lot of the ideology that undergirds ISIS, this jihadi, Salafi, Wahhabi ideology that is exclusionary, that hates the Shia, that hates the Americans, all of these...
Sorry, Mia, finish your point. No, Mia, finish your point and then Muwafaq. Hold on, Muwafaq, 1 second. Let Mia finish your point, then I'll come to you.
So my point is to say that whether it's through direct funding of Jabhat al-Nusra or Jabhat Fatah al-Sham or all of the groups in Syria that are fighting, or the fact that the ideology has been really just green-lit by the Saudis for so long until they themselves became the targets of terrorism, I think there is a serious problem. We can't just point at one or two countries. Many of these countries have blood on their hands.
Ahmed Yayla, you were a counter-terrorism chief in Turkey till a few years ago. There's a lot of talk about the so-called jihadist highway from Turkey into Syria. Is it true, in your view, from your experience, the Turkish government turned a blind eye to fighters going across to fight against Assad?
It is true. It's not a blind eye. It is a full-force support, directly and indirectly. If we look at 2011, when the conflict started, Erdogan deemed it was to its best interest to back those jihadis, Salafist terrorist organizations, for a quick change in Syria, and also at the same time to counter the PKK and YPG in the region. So with that, he started to support those terrorist organizations. The flow of foreign fighters on the ground were very visible, and the police directly was ordered not to intervene with that.
But wouldn't the Turkish government say, we were supporting the Syrian opposition rebels, we've never hid that fact, we weren't supporting ISIS or Al-Qaeda?
It doesn't matter. You can see very easily, there are a lot of instances that Turkish police or other forces captured ongoing transfers of weapons, missiles and foreign fighters. And on top of that, it wasn't only closing their eyes. In some cases, Turkish intelligence officially transferred weapons and fighters to Syria.
So there is this claim, Hassan, I want you to deal with this claim, that the government didn't just turn a blind eye. It wasn't just individuals sending money. This was an active policy to support, that's quite a big claim, to support a group like ISIL, governments in the region.
I think it's a subtle argument there, which is Turkey certainly wanted jihadists to go after the Kurds and to go after Bashar al-Assad. In fact, Turkey said these things to the Americans in Turkey in 2013. They pitched basically Islamists as a way to remove Bashar al-Assad and then deal with jihadism after that.
Muwafaq, you wanted to come in earlier on when Mia was speaking.
On Saudi, let me disclose one thing. More than 55% of those who committed suicide bombs in Iraq were Saudi nationals. And if you want to look for the largest manufacturing plant in the world for manufacturing terrorists, is the alleyways of Jeddah and Medina and Mecca. That's where the real making of terrorists, because this is the extremist Wahhabi ideology spreading all over the world. It's the billions and billions of dollars being spent over the last few decades.
A lot of people would say,
and promulgating this ideology.
Okay, a lot of people would agree with you on the ideological point. I saw Mia nodding when you mentioned Saudi Arabia. But they'd also say, look, it's not just ideology. The actions of the Bashar al-Assad regime have also created a lot of quote-unquote terrorists and suicide bombers. And that is a government backed by the Iraqi government and by the Iranian government, is it not?
Well, I think this is symptoms. See, we should not concentrate on the symptoms of the disease. We should look for the etiology, the root cause of the disease. What do the Bin Laden and Zawahiri and Boko Haram in Nigeria and Nusra in Syria and Al-Qaeda in Iraq and Afghanistan and Pakistan and Yemen and Al-Shabaab in Somalia, what do they share all? And 9/11, what do they share all? They share one single denominator, and that is this ideology, this evil ideology called extremist Wahhabi ideology.
Let me bring in Hassan and then Ahmed.
Well, I have to disagree with that. I think blaming Wahhabism has been more of a slogan than a reality. Tunisians joined. There are more Tunisians in ISIS, at least per capita, than the Saudis. And I cannot imagine how you could know that 50% or 55% of suicide bombers who blow themselves up and would be in, you wouldn't know their identity. They wouldn't have their IDs with them to know that they are Saudis. And ISIS doesn't disclose all the names of the suicide bombers. So I cast doubt.
From the kunya, Hassan, we get the information. Very often we have Saudi kunyas. Yeah. So in fairness to Minister Al-Rubai, we do know that after Tunisia, the next group is the Saudis in terms of the number of foreign fighters.
Well, ISIS has carried out more than 1,000 suicide bomber attack over the past 3 years. I challenge anyone to give me the name of at least 10% of those people.
Mia, what are all these latest attacks by ISIL outside of Iraq and Syria, in Kabul, in Paris, in London, even in Tehran? What do they tell us about the group's strategy going forward? What are they trying to achieve with these attacks? What's the strategy behind them?
The strategy goes back to what I said earlier about the desire to project power and remain relevant in the face of what looks to be like battlefield disasters. And as Hassan said, they're surrounded in Raqqa, they're mostly out of Mosul. But there also is an important disaggregation or differentiation to make. We see a lot of attacks in the name of ISIS, but only a small number of attacks that are actually directed by ISIS. And this is where looking at inside, on the Telegram channels and the chat rooms, huge differences when it actually has ISIS's footprint versus when it's just some random person.
So they opportunistically take credit for quote-unquote lone wolves, in your view?
Right, and so you'll have people, whether it's in San Bernardino or Orlando, who are making phone calls and pretending to pledge allegiance to the caliphate. And one of the things I found most interesting is when ISIS produced an infographic of the attacks in the United States, they had San Bernardino and Orlando in the same state of Florida. So if they don't even know that San Bernardino is in California, I doubt very much that they had a hand in it, as compared to the live feed from Tehran, where you could watch with the GoPro cameras, you could watch the attack in the Tehran, in the Iranian parliament, in real time.
Okay, Ahmed, is it time, especially in the West, for the media in particular, to distinguish between actual ISIS-directed attacks and those that are opportunistically claimed by them but carried out by mentally ill or angry or just people who want some attention and decide to shout ISIL or Allah before they kill innocent people in Orlando or somewhere else?
It is definitely, but when you look at the scenario on the ground, most of those people were known by the local law enforcement and intelligence agencies. So we are missing a point here. Even though in the West, those people are known to the authorities, they are able to carry out those attacks, regardless of they are directly tied to the ISIS or not. So,
but aren't you ramping up ISIL's power and appeal by attributing every attack to them, or taking seriously every claim they make for an attack? Or are you saying we should take them seriously when they make those claims?
We should take them seriously.
Even Orlando, for example, where the guy pledged allegiance to Hezbollah 3 years earlier. He clearly didn't have a clue between the different groups.
Example.
Yeah.
But so far, most of their claims came out as correct. And we must understand that terrorist organizations live and stay alive by their propaganda and ongoing actions. As ISIS is losing territory in Syria and in Iraq, we are going to see a lot of more attacks in the West and elsewhere. And as the media pumps those attacks, they are very happy because a small attack provides them media coverage that nobody can do.
Hassan, are we going to see more quote-unquote lone wolf attacks? And are they genuinely lone wolves in your view?
I worry that there will be more and more such attacks, and I think it's evidence that ISIS kind of appeal outside is not affected by how it's doing on the ground. But the lone wolf attacks carried out in the name of ISIS, I call them a complicated kind of lone wolves, meaning they are most likely, unlike say the ones that can carry out attacks in the name of Al-Qaeda, they have some sort of training online. They meet, like they speak to someone, they get instructions, so they have some links. You can define these links, and you can say they are not really.
Is there a difference between being inspired and being directed? Is that a fair distinction?
Yes, absolutely. Directed usually is someone who has training by ISIS, has a supervisor with ISIS, and ISIS chooses the target. An example of that is what happened in Tehran when they chose the most symbolic sites in Tehran to attack.
Okay, Muwaffaq, you said at the start of this show that we're missing the point. It's not about territory, it's about ideology. It's about defeating the group on an ideological level. How do we declare victory against ISIL? When do we declare victory against ISIL? Is it possible to know the point where we've won, the rest of the world has won, and ISIL has lost?
I think it's extremely difficult to see this time when we declare victory on ISIS. I believe there have been billions and billions of dollars being spent in promulgating this ideology all over the world, in hundreds and thousands of mosques all over the world, in the Muslim world and in Europe and America. So I believe we need to spend billions and billions of dollars to reverse this ideology and protect the world.
Okay, we're running out of time. One final question to you all. Let me ask the same question to all of you briefly, if you can answer. When do we know that we've won? Is it possible to know we've won? Mia?
I think that it depends on how you define win. Many terrorist groups have cycles in which there are periods of time where they're very strong, and then periods of time where they almost go into hibernation to re-emerge later on. The PKK in Turkey is a perfect example. It has reincarnated itself so many different times. So we don't really have a final moment, even when we have peace treaties. The Good Friday Agreement in Northern Ireland, there are dissidents that emerged after that.
Okay.
So even if we do win at some level, there's always the danger that there are going to be some crazy people that come forward in the name of distorting this religion and continue to fight in the name of ISIS or whatever comes next.
Ahmed.
I agree with Mia. There are a lot of different aspects that we need to consider. However, on the long run, we need to focus on the Salafist jihadi ideology, basically prevent their recruitment. If we can basically dry out the swamp instead of killing mosquitoes, we are going to be successful, which is preventing their recruitment and spread of their Salafist jihadi ideology. Without that, they are going to live forever.
Okay. Hassan.
I think there will not be a victory. ISIS is losing, but nobody is winning against it. And the problem we have today really is misdiagnosis of the situation. 3 years later, we still don't understand the ISIS ideology. We blame it on something that it's not. And we also misunderstand the grievances that led to the rise of ISIS in the first place.
We'll have to leave it there. Thank you all for joining me on the show. Up Front will be back next week.